Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next episode in the Who's Next series. DORA, are you late to the party? This is a critical overview of DORA requirements and compliance. And my name is Aaron Stillman, and I'm going to be your host today. I'm the head of product marketing here at Tresorit, born in the United States, but now living the dream in Europe. And I'm welcomed here to talk about DORA and its key requirements and best practices with Ben. Ben, if you could just take a quick minute and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thanks, Aaron, and pleasure to be here. Um, so I have 25 plus years. I stopped counting after 25 years worth of experience in security, way before it was called cyber, when it was IT security. And we used to have to go cap in hand to get money to do the security controls. I've worked in technology businesses, within the advisory space, within outsourcers, and I've spent over just around 5 years in financial services working in the end client space. Um, I've worked on advisory councils for some of the major security events. One that's coming up again in June this year. I've been on industry boards and I've worked closely with regulators. And now I run a company called ICA Consultancy. We've been around for just over 7 years. We provide advisory, consultancy, fractional resourcing, and a discrete set of managed services to mid-market organizations across multiple industries.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Ben. I've enjoyed our conversations leading up to this. So let's go ahead and dive in. What is DORA and why does it matter? So, cyber attacks pose an acute threat to the financial global sector. We see this year after year, report after report, and in this sector in particular, 12 billion in direct losses from cyber incidents have occurred over the past 2 decades. According to an International Monetary Fund report, nearly one-fifth of cyber incidents affect the financial sector. Obviously, banks being the most frequent targets, followed by insurers and asset managers. And this makes sense considering the sensitive nature of data related to this financial sector. You get the combination of the personal information as well as the financial information. So, in response to the growing number of incidents, the EU, European Union, has now introduced the Digital Operational Resilience Act, aka DORA, which is what we're here for. And after 2 years of a transition period, the regulation has now come into effect very recently, just earlier in the week, January 17th. So the spotlight is now on implementation and enforcement. Ben, just to kick us off and sort of set the stage, can you explain in more detail what DORA is, why is it such a big deal for the financial sector, and its relation to NIS2 and other regulations like GDPR?
Yeah, and I think GDPR is probably a very good reference point, and I'll probably mention that a few times just to help with some comparisons. So, DORA is a regulation, much like GDPR was a regulation within the EU. Um, it's a framework that looks at the operational resilience around digital infrastructure. Organizations, whether it's financial services or other industries, have a heavy reliance on technology these days to deliver their services, automation, and the increasing use of AI. Now, the big difference between DORA and this is DORA is a regulation, which means all EU member states have to comply with it, and any organisations outside of EU that are serving those member states in financial services have to comply. NIS 2 is a directive, and what happens with a directive is it gets implemented in local law by each of those member states. GDPR was a regulation; we all had to comply with that regulation, whereas previously NIS, when we were a member of the EU, we had NIS, but we implemented that within local regulations. Now, the key kind of components of DORA, there's the 5 pillars as we refer to it. So we've got risk management, the identification and management of risks within your ICT estate, incident management, the definition and operation of an incident management plan, the testing of that plan and lessons learned, the digital op resilience. So in old money, we would be talking about business continuity or more broadly business resilience. Third party risk management that we all should be doing, right? And looking at the categorization and the risks introduced by using third parties. And an optional one, which is around information sharing. So they're encouraging financial services organizations now to share information around threats and around the incidents that they are seeing.
All right. Well, that's a good overview. And we just talked about the fact that last week everything went into action, right, on January 17th. So help us understand a little bit now that the deadline is passed, what are the critical actions that businesses should have already, taken by now?
Yeah, so like with many things, really where organisations should have started is completing those risk assessments. So we spoke about one of the pillars being around risk assessment, risk management within ICT. So risk should have been assessed, control should have been identified, gaps should have been remediated. Everything that organisations should be doing should be based off risk and actually prioritisation following that. Organisations should have developed an incident management response plan if they didn't have it. That could include playbooks or run books to deal with specific types of incidents. Those should have been tested either through desktop exercises or real life simulations. So red teaming and other activities. There should be evidence that they have then reviewed and updated those plans. Third parties should have been categorized and risk assessed. So if you're not already doing due diligence or in-life assurance on your third parties, there should be evidence of that. Operational resilience testing should have come into play. So whether that's business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, crisis management plans, we should be looking at how we're going to maintain through various different scenarios the resilience of the infrastructure. If organizations do want to do information sharing, and let's be clear, a lot of financial services organizations already are. You've got FS-ISAC, you've got the Cyber Coordination Group in the UK. These are all being run by the financial services regulators or supported by them to at least encourage that sharing. We should have been seeing organisations training their staff on the importance of DORA and therefore also these various elements. And also, let's be clear, a lot of organisations will struggle, mainly due to size and complexity, to necessarily hit compliance by the 17th of January. So there should be that plan as well in place that says, actually, we know what some of these gaps are. No organisation will have addressed every single one of its risks. It's also, as we spoke about, leading up to this, it's an ongoing process, right? We new risks emerge, people launch new products, go into new markets, they engage new third parties, want to process new information or share information in a new way. All these risks need to be managed and continually identified and assessed.
So Ben, this is something I enjoyed when we were sort of talking and leading up to it, and we decided to include it here in the conversation. One of the things that we can pick response time or anything else that you just talked about, but when there's overlap between, let's say, GDPR and DORA, which one wins? Do you follow GDPR? Do you follow DORA? How do you make that decision? What should people be thinking about on this topic?
Yeah, so I think it's very important that organisations look at their regulatory compliance as a whole rather than just going, right, DORA's come along, I need to comply with DORA. Clearly, you do need to comply with DORA, but in that example, I think it's a great example when we talk about notification timelines. If we take GDPR and NIS previously, because we've had experience of that here in the UK, GDPR introduced this concept of mandatory reporting to a supervisory authority, in the UK ICO, within 72 hours of becoming aware of a data breach that would impact the rights and freedoms of data subjects. However, NIS, for those people that fell into scope of NIS, introduced one that was 24 hours. So organizations that have to comply with these multiple regulations need to look at things like mandatory reporting requirements and understand which is the one that they need to meet the soonest. Because actually, if they spent time looking at 72 hours for the ICO for GDPR, they could miss the fact that actually they were meant to report that 48 hours ago under then their obligations under NIS. So it was exactly the same with GDPR. When it came in, there were a lot of conversations to be very clear that just because it's GDPR, it doesn't trump your other regulations. And actually, GDPR was worded very clearly in a way to say things like retaining data for as long as it is necessary. Well, that necessary included other regulations. So when looking at DORA and complying with DORA, and specifically around incident management, you need to understand your regulatory requirements, you need to understand your reporting requirements, and they will come from multiple regulations depending on your region, the scope of services you provide, size, etc.
Yep. No, that makes sense. And I love that example you used. So, okay, we talked about what companies should have already done to January 17th. I loved how you set the stage to sort of indicate that this is a living and breathing situation. Dynamics change, markets change. But for companies that did miss the deadline, what should they do sort of most immediately or in a prioritized way?
Well, I think again, and I mentioned it at the front, I'm going to use GDPR a few times. I think we can look back to the 25th of May 2018 and the number of organisations that weren't necessarily as prepared as they should have been for that enforcement date. I suspect there will be organisations in a similar state with DORA. Um, if you're in that position, then very much I think where you need to start with is that gap analysis against the articles within the regulation. It's always better to be in a position of being very clear on where your failings are and your plan to address that, rather than be in a position of just going, well, I don't really know where I am against this regulation. And it will influence the conversation you will end up having should anything happen and there be any kind of inspection visit. So I would start with that. There's many ways you can do that. You can do that gap analysis internally, looking at the articles, going through that. You can certainly look to a third party to support you in doing that gap analysis. The beauty is with DORA, it's not brand new. Roughly, rough numbers, about 80% of it maps directly back to something like NIST cybersecurity framework. So if you're already looking at your maturity based on that, you can start to do that mapping and work out where your gaps may be.
Hmm.
And once you've got that, collating information around what risk assessments you have been doing, what you're doing around third parties, any resilience testing, incident plans, bring that together so you start to build out a view of, right, I've got a baseline, I am doing something, what do I need to do to get to those specific requirements? So, for example, lots of organizations are doing pen testing. Whether they're doing it as often and with the right scope, that's a different conversation, but they're doing pen testing. It's very specific within DORA that you need to be doing threat-led pen testing. So what's that change you have to make to, well, I'm already doing pen testing, but I need to do something different in the way I scope it and engage it. And that should be a relatively straightforward process for most organizations. I think, there's a bit of time to map out the articles. There's a bit of time to understand the specific requirements. But a lot of organizations, the reason they will be in a position of needing to do this is capacity. There's a lot of organizations, high pace of change, already trying to work on issues that they might already have. So as I say, plenty of organizations out there that could help you kind of get that understanding.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I also like the way you used sort of the NIST readiness as a benchmark. So let's keep going in this direction with technology. So, at Tresorit, we have a lot of financial industry, financial service customers because of the sort of zero knowledge end-to-end encryption that Tresorit offers and the need for this industry to protect the sensitive information. On your side, what role do you see technology playing for supporting a business that's catching up and wanting to be in compliance with DORA?
So, I think, for me, when we talk about something like this, technology tends to fall into two camps. We've got the technology that supports us with our compliance in terms of our GRC aspects. And then we have the technology that supports the controls that we're implementing because we've identified a risk. So,
Hmm.
when we look at the kind of GRC side of things, larger organizations are going to struggle to manage their risks through spreadsheets. So, I would be looking for a GRC platform, and there's plenty out there that can help you with your risk management, help you with your third party risk management, help you with your business resilience and tracking your testing and actions that come out of it. Compliance management modules that look at ISO, NIST, DORA, GDPR as terms of your compliance against that. And it's even underpinned now by continuous control monitoring. So actually plugging into your systems to look at password policy, access logs, is MFA turned on, and whatever else is available as far as telemetry from those systems. There's a lot of automation that can happen. And there's plenty of those platforms that are now sticking AI in it as well, because let's face it, you can't have technology without AI. So, I would be looking at that to simplify the compliance processes. And I think you're absolutely right when you talk about, in terms of the control side, we can look at a variety of different scenarios and different incidents that could impact an organization and impact their resilience. And data availability of data and integrity of data is always key when you look at those. So being in a position where actually you can identify and protect that sensitive data, and be in a position where actually you can recover that quickly, defend it against attacks in the first place. But if something does happen, know that you still have access to it, and some other malicious individual hasn't, locked the padlock on it and holding you to ransom for it. I think it is absolutely invaluable to organizations.
Yeah, that's sort of the bread and butter and what we hear on a regular basis. So, as we touched upon the role of encrypted tools and data management and making sure that if someone malicious or bad ends up getting a hold of something, they can actually unlock and gain access to it. Um, so we hear this when talking to prospects, talking to clients about their challenges, and what we see is, the regulation emphasizes the availability, integrity, confidentiality, and the authenticity of the data. And to meet this requirement, financial organizations need a system that safeguards that data. Whether it's safeguarding from unauthorized access or being tampered with or losing it altogether, while ensuring accessibility during a crisis or a disruption. So within Trezor, we see a lot around, encrypted data rooms playing a role in allowing financial industry organizations to run their business and focus on their business without, sort of the fear and the worry of someone being able to get a hold of that data. So on your side, Ben, in your experience, how do you see sort of these end-to-end encrypted data rooms fitting into the picture of DORA compliance and DORA compliant data management? And if you have any sort of examples from your past, that would be great to hear as well.
Yeah, so look, I think the key part of DORA is talking about that resilience, right, and the ability to withstand and absorb attacks. So obviously, when you look at something like ransomware as an example, the whole kind of foundation of that attack is the intrusion into your network or services, and then the encryption, the locking of your data to stop you from being able to access it, to stop you from being able to continue to process and provide your services, and then holding you to ransom for it. Well, if you're in a position where actually you can already hold the key to that data and a lock over it, then actually the impact of a ransomware attack will certainly be focused away from that data that you already have that kind of control over. I think also when I mentioned it earlier, organizations are heavily reliant on third parties. And actually, that reliance on third parties is increasing the amount of data that we need to share. I was just this very morning, I was actually talking to one of our clients, and we're in this process of sharing some, it happens to be about their risk management framework. So, sharing information about their risk management framework and the risks that they have identified, and actually looking at a way of doing that securely and ensuring actually that once we have access to that data, we use it for the purpose that we need it for in this particular engagement, but they control that access, right? And let's be clear, some of the kind of standard productivity suites that are available to do that come with their challenges and their complexities and probably a little bit of concern. And again, is even to the point of sharing that information with regulators and being able to provide that information out to authorities when something does go wrong. You want to be in a position where you are still controlling your data in those events. And then on top of that, you want to make sure that you've actually got detailed audit logs of who's accessing it, when they're accessing it, how they're accessing it. So you can audit that to make sure that actually it's still the appropriate people, and you can actually revoke that based on need or lack of need.
Yep.
So I think there are financial services in particular, but I think you can go across a multitude of industries where actually we just have this need to protect our information. That's ultimately what we do with cybersecurity, is to stand around and say, what are we protecting? What are our critical assets? And at the cornerstone of that will usually be data.
Yep, all that makes sense and aligns with, what we hear as sort of the pain points when people are transitioning from one of those platforms that make it a little bit more challenging to others that are really focused on, the sensitivity of the data. So if we if a if we get to a point where a business has achieved compliance, what would be the practical tips that you would give to ensure they stay compliant? Because as you mentioned in the beginning, markets change, you go into a new market, products get launched. What would you be recommending companies put in place in order to monitor and make sure they're adjusting along the way?
Well, I think the basics of things like risk management, third-party risk management, as they are continual processes. When you think about risk management, as we said, new risks will emerge depending on what the business is doing. Controls will perhaps lose efficiency. In other places, the risk will reduce, and therefore your control doesn't need to be quite as efficient. I mean, there is the potential for money-saving activities as we go through proper risk management. If we really want to get into the bare bones of it, risk is also about opportunity, not just about things that can cause you harm, right?
Yep.
But it's a continual process. So we always advise that organizations look at review processes, ongoing review processes based on the residual risk rating. So if you've got a particularly high residual risk rating, you're going to be looking at that perhaps on a weekly, fortnightly basis. Whereas
Hmm.
some of your lower risks, you're going to be reviewing maybe quarterly, half annually, or annually, depending on that score. You're going to want to be able to be reporting this information up to your various subcommittees and board to make sure that they are clear on that risk profile, and also explaining to them both in terms of impacts to the organization in terms of operational impact, but also around your regulatory compliance and tracking that. Because just like people that look to be certified against things like ISO 27001, it's continuous that they're collecting the data, demonstrating the controls are working. You do the same thing with regulations, collecting data, demonstrating compliance, identifying weaknesses, and fixing any non-conformities that might be identified. The landscape changes. You see different threats, different vulnerabilities. Day doesn't go by where you don't get told about some issue in some part of your estate that you've had either for years or just got, right. You need to be looking at continually testing your resilience. So whether that's every half year, every year, again, decisions need to be made on how frequently you do that. And then you need to be looking at the lessons that come out of that. It's not just a point of running a test and going, I've ticked my box and I've run the test. It's what did I learn? What worked? What didn't work? We all too often see when going into organizations that they've got their disaster recovery plan, but when you look at it, it's like, well, you wrote that 2 years ago, and that was half of that was on prem. It's now all in the cloud. How is this actually going to work?
Yep.
As I mentioned before, one of the areas is this continuous control monitoring, growing part of the GRC landscape. It doesn't work for all organizations. Sometimes it can be you're just too complex to get that kind of level of automation set up. It might be you're too small to justify the cost, because there's a cost in looking at that tooling. But that is a great place. If it's right for you, then actually at a touch of a button, you can sit there and say, how am I managing my risks? What does my compliance look like? Where are my gaps against frameworks? And actually, one of the key things, and we've spoken about this for years, I've written articles, and some are on LinkedIn about it. It's about the culture of the organization. Because the most effective thing that we always see, whether it's defending against cyber or supporting the regulation, is a culture within the organization that understands it.
Yep.
Because, your staff will be your front line, first people to turn around and say, this control isn't working, right? Or there's a risk due to the way that we are operating. My own personal examples of it are when I was in industry, we did something really simple and set up a mailbox called Ask Information Security. And anyone could ask a question of the organization around security from there. And when we launched a Crest Star, which is a stimulated, threat-led kind of red teaming exercise, and one of the attacks that they tried was a phishing attack, that mailbox lit up. And actually, that was one of our key defenses with these kind of widespread or targeted attacks, because people were aware rather than I'd much rather than them just raising incidents. If they needed to, they could ask the team a question and say, "This doesn't look right. What do you want me to do?" Um, so I think the culture is something that you need to bring on board. People need to know why you're asking them to do the things you're doing, the implications of that not getting done, and encourage a very open, no blame culture so people can just turn around and say, "This isn't working. We need to change."
Yep, that completely makes sense. I also really appreciate the way you sort of highlight, sometimes it's not just about risk, it's also about opportunity. And the culture of the company, feeling empowered to speak up and be on those front lines and the benefit of that. So uh, all right, I think we're coming close to a close. What's 1 to 3 key takeaways, the folks who are listening, you'd like them to walk away with and really remember coming out of this whole conversation.
Okay, so look, I think, as we mentioned, compliance is an ongoing process, right? So it's not a one and done, as we've spoken about before. You need to always know where your place is against your risks, and again, DORA is just about managing your risks that impact your resilience. And I think with any business, you've got to aim for compliance. How you get to compliance and some of the decisions you make along there should be based on risk, benefit, cost, etc. Right? So it's got to be a process where you're going to get buy-in from a lot of people. You're going to have to be able to get the information together, surface that, and enable people to make those business decisions. I think it's important, as we mentioned, culture. We mentioned that just as we were speaking just now. I think culture is a very key part. And I think, look, if you talk to me, if people have ever spoken to me before, I am one of these people that says there's no silver bullet, right? You can implement all the controls you want. A user will still click on something or do something, or a third party won't interact in the right way. But there is a baseline that you need to have in terms of tooling. And I think there is a great marketplace out there at the moment to support organizations in securing their data, but you need to be risk led on it. So, if you just go to the market and say, "What have you got to fix my common problems?" I think you'll end up spending the next 5 years going through brochures and talking to salespeople. Start with your risk, understand your pain point, and then get out there. And also, and I probably would say this because of the type of organization I operate, but there is expertise available to you to fill those capability and capacity gaps. And there are individuals out there that have worked in industry that are now looking to provide expertise back. So do your research as well, and find organisations that can help you in your sector, your size, with real world experience.
Yeah, I think that's really sound advice. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. In particular, you, Ben. It was a delight to be able to have this chat. I hope everyone who joined us has learned as much as I did from Ben about DORA, the importance of compliance as a, trust building and resilience strategy for your business. So if you like this video, you'd like to learn more about protecting your data, please look at Tresorit's Insights playlist for the other videos. And if you have any more information you're looking for about Tresorit or ICA consultancy, you can visit our websites, as you can see. And I'd just like to thank you and wish you a wonderful rest of your day and year. Cheers.
Thank you.